Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It is my great honor to introduce the one and the only, the inimitable Judy Platt, who will honor us all by sharing her wisdom and her words of Torah today. Judy, it's all yours.
That's a hard act to follow, Ezra, and if I could have designed the bat mitzvah I never had, I would have chosen Parashat Bo for my Parsha. Can there be anywhere in the Torah a narrative more dramatic or portentous? The last and most devastating of the plagues have visited upon Egypt, an endless sea of locusts who devour everything, a thick darkness that suffocates not only the senses, but the minds and the souls of the Egyptians. And finally, most horribly, the slaughter of all non-Hebrew firstborn. This is the Parsha in which the Israelites are commanded to establish a calendar, given detailed instructions for the first Passover meal and for observing a festival of unleavened bread in the future, commanded to remember and to relate the story of the liberation from bondage in every generation, and at the end of which, Sof, Pharaoh throws up his hands and orders Moses and the Israelites out of Egypt. Throughout the narrative, it is clear that Pharaoh is a bully surrounded by sycophants. But who is this Pharaoh? In a commentary on Parashat Bo, former JTS Chancellor Arnold Eisen provides us with a dead-on description. He is not like the first Pharaoh in the Exodus story, who founded the system of repression to which this Pharaoh is heir. By the time of his rule, the regime of evil is well established. His task is to maintain it. He's a routine tyrant, a manager, not at all a creative or purposeful leader, a leader incapable of leading, a ruler who will not adapt to new realities, rethink the givens of his system, face the facts, or hear cries, and his lack of political imagination will prove fatal. A couple of weeks ago in his sermon on Vayechi, Rabbi Steinlauf talked about the inevitability of living with uncertainty and the gift of free will to make choices within that uncertainty. The free will that allows us to be responsible and moral human beings. The free will we were given as compensation for being kicked out of Gan Eden. In trying to unravel the threads woven into the fabric of this Parsha, I kept coming back to two of them, free will and collateral damage. In hardening his heart, has God taken away Pharaoh's free will, depriving him of the chance to change his mind and free the Hebrew slaves? And if this is the case, who's the real villain of the piece? It is a question that has been asked endlessly by biblical commentators, ancient and modern. In an essay on the ethical problem of hardening Pharaoh's heart, Professor Shaul Magid points to Rashi's commentary, noting that although God knows that Pharaoh will not repent, he only loses the ability to comply with God's demands after he has had 5 chances to do so. During the first 5 plagues, it was Pharaoh himself who hardened his own heart. Rashi said he's had ample opportunity to comply, but after a certain time, God punished him by refusing to allow him to repent. I found the elegance of Maimonides' argument really resonated. Rambam argues that the loss of free will is only a punishment resulting from free will. That is, the continuous choice to act wickedly. And that a person can be conscious that his inability to act is itself a punishment, but still be unable to choose to do the very thing that would lift the punishment. The notes in our Chumash that accompanied last week's reading of Va'era contained a detailed discussion of this question, including a quote from psychoanalyst Erich Fromm. Fromm said that the more a man's heart hardens, the less freedom he has to change, the more he is determined by previous action, so that there comes a point of no return when man's heart has become so hardened that he has lost the possibility of freedom. But as insightful as it is, Rabbi Suzanne Singer says that Fromm's argument begs the question of the text's plain meaning, which is that God causes Pharaoh's stubbornness. She suggests that perhaps the most satisfactory approach is to keep the theological problems ever present. Citing arguments put forward by biblical scholar Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg in The Particulars of Rapture, her study of Exodus. What Zornberg terms the master narrative of the liberation story gives rise to counter narratives, calling forth potentially heretical questions. The best way to address the dissonance between narrative and counter narrative, Zornberg asserts, is the model of endless questioning in which the answer does not totally silence the questioner. Conforming to this model of endless questioning in confronting and challenging troubling aspects of our sacred narratives, Rabbi Singer reminds us of our obligation to remember that our night of liberation was one of horror for the Egyptians. This, of course, is the second thread I've chosen to unravel, that of collateral damage. Rabbi Singer writes, we must continue to ask the questions that preserve our awareness of the other story. Did the Israelites hear the tza'akah, the cry of the Egyptians? Did it remind them of their own cry, which brought God's attention to their plight? Year after year, as we recall at our Seder table the wonders God performed for us, we must remember the price the other paid for our liberation. Elaborating on this theme, Rabbi Reuven Greenwald wrote that the raising of critical questions about the Torah is not an attempt to whitewash our sacred texts. Rather, raising questions is what Jewish tradition has always done, to reapply its core values of justice and mercy to the complicated struggles in each generation. Rabbi Greenwald points to the fact that Moses himself was much esteemed in the land of Egypt, and he wondered if this admiration is a yearning for Moses, the former Egyptian prince, to include them too in his resistance to tyranny. Rabbi Greenwald says, if this is the case, then the loss of innocent life among suffering peoples becomes a poignant basis for a morality discussion. Greenwald quotes a stanza from a very controversial poem published by Israeli poet Natan Alterman in 1943, at the height of World War II and the Holocaust. The judgment of swords has no fault, but when the shedding of blood is spent, it leaves, like a taste of salt, the tears of the innocent. The poem raised moral questions regarding the loss of innocent lives on the wrong side of a battle between good and evil, expressing the poet's fear that in seeking victory for the right side of history, compassion for ordinary people on the wrong side may be lost. In an anthology called Sarah's Choice, the poet Eleanor Wilner includes a heartbreaking reimagining of Miriam's song in the wake of the 10th plague. Death to the firstborn sons always, the first fruits to the gods of men. She had not meant it so. Standing in the reeds back then, the current tugging at her skirt like hands. She had only meant to save her little brother Moses, red-faced with rage when he was given to the river. Years later, when the gray angel, like the smoke trail of a dying comet, passed by their houses with blood smeared over the doorways, Miriam, her head hot in her hands, wept as the city swelled with the wail of Egypt's women. Shabbat Shalom.